I'm very, very happy to welcome Guido Palazzo here today. So Guido is, in the Swiss system, we call this professeur ordinaire, but actually this generally means professeur extraordinaire, even though this is also being used. Is professor of business ethics at HEC Lausanne in the University of Lausanne. I don't think I need to spend a long time introducing Guido to you. You've all seen a lot of his work. I really like a sentence I found on one of the websites that describes him, where it says that he's passionate about the dark side of the force and examines unethical decision-making from various angles. I think that's a very nice summary of Guido's work. You all know that Guido has published very broadly on many different types of issues, naturally on CSR and on the political dimension of CSR, on multi-stakeholder initiatives in transnational governance, on the political role of actors like global firms, NGOs, in that context, in our contemporary world, on the ethics of business and on the ethics of decision-making in business, in business firms in particular, unethical practices in and around organizations. And the work that is going to talk to us today is, I think, slightly different. It's a thread of work that actually is looking, and I find it particularly interesting, and we have stories of why we find those work interesting, because we did a same tour at some point in Napoli, which triggered a lot of interest for us, but he will tell about this. So looking at communities and societies that are dominated by organized crime, illegal or gray zone activities. So this is, I think, another thread of his work that obviously is very interesting. The paper, as you could see, is also extremely fascinating paper. So I'm really very much looking forward to hearing him present this thread of work. And I certainly don't need to say why the C2G2 is inviting Guido, because it's definitely at the core of the types of issues that we are interested in at the center. So Guido, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you.
And again, whenever you want to ask questions, the microphone is...
Yes, don't hesitate to interrupt me if you have questions. Thank you, Marie-Laure, for your kind words, your introduction. I called this From Organizational to Organized Crime, and it shows a bit my journey as a researcher. For more than 10 years, I worked on CSR-related topics. And a few years ago, I realized that I started to repeat myself, and that I became a bit bored of my own stuff. And I wanted to do something completely new. And since I'm Italian, there is one topic that is very close to my heart, and that is organized crime. And I had the opportunity to start working on that topic a few years ago, and I became immediately passionate about it, so that I now perceive this as my new focus of research. So I hope that in 10 years I will no longer be perceived as a CSR scholar, but as an organized crime scholar. Marie-Laure asked me not to just present the paper on protection money that I have written with Nino Vaccaro, but to give an idea about the overarching project that I do on organized crime. So I have currently 3 projects at various development stages, and I would like to give you first an overview over all these things that I do related to organized crime before I then zoom into the paper that I will publish soon with Nino Vaccaro. And that doesn't work anymore. It worked before, now it's frozen. Technology. What can I do?
Yes.
No.
It's frozen.
Can I close this?
Yeah, maybe you need to close and reopen it.
It's not frozen though.
No.
No, because it's not written not responding.
And if I do this? Does it work?
Working.
Now it works. Put it in again. Now it works. Thank you. maybe I start with a few general ideas or observations on the research in organized crime. I was amazed when I started to work on that to see that there's almost nothing done. There are a few sociological studies. Most of them are already very old. And you rarely find empirical work on organized crime. Well, there are reasons for that. It's not that easy to get data on organized crime. I cannot just go there and interview these guys. Well, actually you can sometimes, but it's maybe not the best thing to do. It's a largely ignored space in society, even though it is of tremendous importance to understand globalization, for instance. It's roughly 10% of the global financial flows that are coming from organized crime. So it's a substantial part of the financial system. And it's, as I will show you, it's a substantial part of many industries. The mafia is connected to a lot of what seems to be legal business operations. And not to go and look into these procedures, I think it's a bit surprising and shouldn't be the case. My own research in that field is dominated by two interests. The first one is the collusion between organized crime and normal corporations. So I'm looking at the interface. And the second is I'm interested in change processes. And if you're interested in change processes, mafia is a fascinating phenomenon because in some parts of Italy, but also in other countries, it is older than 100 years. So you have routines that are like the protection money that I will talk about later, which is 150 years old, unchanged. So since 150 years, people pay. And if you ask yourself, how can you change institutions? It is fascinating to look at institutions that are what I have tried to call hyper-stable. The reviewers didn't like it, so we dropped the word hyper-stable, but that's what it is about. It's extremely stable institutions, but since they are social institutions, they must be changeable. It's not possible that there are human-created institutions that cannot be changed. How can they be changed? That is one of the interests that I have. When we think about mafia, that's what we normally have in mind. We have in mind this separated world that we know from the mafia films, that is unconnected to us, so we have nothing to do with that. But actually, mafia today is something very, very different. Mafia is present in almost every industry you can imagine. They are the investor number one in green energies. They are the recycler of toxic waste number one in the world. They are in fruits and vegetables, so they organize or they control the markets. They control the mozzarella di bufala market. They are involved in the production of luxury clothes. They are one of the biggest logistics companies in the world. And I could go art. If you have the art market, it is maybe the market that is the most affected by organized crime, because that's the ideal market to wash money, to launder money. Whether something costs 1 million or 20 million, who can really say this is too much or not enough? And that's the space where you can put all your illegal money and wash it and make it clean. Banking, construction, you name it. So there are in many, many legal industries as one actor or even as a dominating actor in some of them. In Italy, there are 3 internationally active organizations. It's the only country in the world that has 3 international mafia organizations. I'm not sure whether it's something one can be proud of, but that's the case. Cosa Nostra is the one in Sicily. That's the eldest, and I would say today the most harmless one. And 'Ndrangheta in Calabria and Camorra in Campania. And Camorra is an organization that the American government puts in the top 10 of the most dangerous organizations for the American interests. So you can imagine that there is a lot of power behind these organizations. Turnover estimated in Italy in 2010, 138 billion euros. Sorry, forgot to put this. 104 billion profit. And if you look at the relation between turnover and profit, you see this is a very interesting market for investments. Estimations, and I guess these are very conservative estimations, are that it represents 10 to 15% of the Italian national product. I have seen also estimations of much more than that. What do I do in this domain? I go through these projects, starting with the one where I have the least information about, so with my starting project. I'm looking right now into Chinese sweatshops in Italy. As you might know, Italy, especially the region around Florence, has thousands of illegal production sites with illegal Chinese immigrants who produce clothes for the luxury Italian brands. You might not know it. Many people don't know. It's something that is not that much in the media. It was recently in the media because one of these sweatshops burnt down, and quite a few of these Chinese workers died because the doors were locked. Very similar to what we have seen in Bangladesh and elsewhere. So this is one of my projects. The second one that is a bit more advanced, I look into the toxic waste business of the Camorra in Campania and beyond. And I am interested, or we are interested in this project in one surprising element of this story. Since more than 25 years, the Camorra is dumping all kinds of toxic waste in South Italy, and nobody talks about that. And I immediately came up with a term for this. I call this institutional silence. I have no clue what this means, but I will find out in the project. Obviously, it is possible to silence certain positions in a discourse in a way that even if it is extremely harmful for everybody, there is no discourse. Or if there's the discourse is about something else, not about the real problem. That's my second project, and the third one is the one I will focus on today, which is a finished project that I did with Nino Vaccaro on fighting organized crime, fighting a particular element of organized crime, which is the protection money. Maybe a few words on the sweatshop story first. What I find fascinating about this is that it seems that Italy reacted to the globalization of production, where everyone was shifting the production of products to Asia with all these sweatshop working conditions problems, by not putting the production elsewhere, but internalizing human rights violations, so that they could compete with Bangladesh and China and the others, and could at the same time keep the production in-house in Italy. Estimations are that there are 5,000 such sweatshops only in the region of Prato, which is a very small place near to Florence, producing for Gucci, Prada, Armani, Dolce & Gabbana, you name it. They're all somehow connected. Originally, I thought this is an organized crime project in the strict sense of Italian mafia being part of that, but I'm not so sure anymore. I work on this project with two co-authors, Michelle Greenwood from Monash in Australia and Claudio Loriodice from Italy. He is not a researcher. He is a former Secret Service agent from Italy, whose specialization is infiltration. So he was one of the first who investigated the transportation of illegal workers from China, Guangdong province, to Prato. And he had to investigate the killing of one of these people organizing these transportations. So you see, it started in the early 90s. And he's on that project because he wants to be a researcher in the future, and he can open up every door as a Secret Service person. That's one of the challenges of organized crime projects. You need to get into the system somehow. Once you're entered, it's easy. But this first step of entering is often very, very difficult. So this is a project where I have no clue where it is going. I have just this basic idea and a team, and we start now with our interviews. Please.
You say these sweatshops are located in central Italy?
Yes, they are in Tuscany. They're in Tuscany. Prato, which is the place that was historically the production site for luxury clothes in Italy, handmade, and it still is, and it's still handmade, but no longer by Italians.
I was just asking because I would have, under the assumption that the visibility, the exposure that these sweatshops can get in like Italy, rather than I was told, for example, in border towns
Yeah.
We visited the southern part of France a couple of years ago. They told us that if you cross the border, that area is big time or old mafioso area. So I
Yeah.
thought that that's where they would operate. But now you are saying that this is the region of the brand itself.
Yeah. Well, there is no organized crime in the strict sense here. It is Chinese organized crime. So it is a network of Chinese actors. The Italian mafia, as it seems so far, plays only a role by taking a fee for each Chinese immigrant that illegally crosses the border and goes to Prato. And some killings
Okay,
of the
so
past,
They are still participating in this whole scheme.
yes, but they're just a gatekeeper.
Oh, okay, yeah. So they're
The rest is organized by the Chinese themselves and by some local criminals in Prato.
okay.
Yeah, one is surprised. Say, well, why is that existing? 5,000 sweatshops, 10,000 of people working there, nobody does something about it. But if you look at these sweatshops, they're sometimes just an apartment under the roof of a house. So it's very difficult. It's not a big thing. It maybe 10 people sitting there and working. And the one that burned down was similar, a hidden place somewhere.
I was thinking that probably they imported this like sweatshop because to use also the network, the cluster of production that was already a presence in the region. So I was thinking, why don't the older producer don't do something about this, because these are direct competitors, I guess. So
it's a system of collusion. The old producers, they fire their people and they hire immigrants.
okay.
There's a book written by someone who's Riccardo Nesi, whose family was a very traditional clothes producer in that region. Story of My People is the title of the book. And he describes the collapse of his family business. So some of them just disappear and others just adapt. They work with these Chinese people and they're much cheaper. They're illegal. And they repay the debts for being transported to Italy partly through work. So there's a bonded labor system, which they never can escape because they have no passport, they have nothing. The second project, so this is my new one and just starting and have some ideas, but no data yet. The second one is about toxic waste. And this is where Marie-Laure said we discovered that together when we were on a conference in Napoli a few years ago and took a trip with a local colleague through these fields of waste in Campania. And I was shocked by this. And for me, this triggered this idea I have to do research on that, because you don't find, at that time, you didn't find a lot in the media. And the problem is immense. We're talking about millions and millions of tons of toxic waste in a very small region. This is just one example. There's one family that within 5 years brought 600,000 tons of tires to that region. That's one bit of the whole story. You find all kind of toxic waste there. You find hospital waste, which is often radioactive. You find the waste of big industries. You find radioactive waste from atomic plants. You find whatever. You find colors from chemical production, from clothing production, and it's all dumped there. And since this is done since more than 25 years, what you get as a result is that slowly a region that the Romans called Campania Felix, because it was their production place for cereals, so frugal arable land, is becoming toxic. You see cauliflowers that should be green and they are yellow because they're full of cadmium and other heavy metals. If you dump for 25 years, that's what you get. The whole region gets toxic. And that's the region where a lot of vegetables and fruits are produced today for European market, but also the mozzarella di bufala comes from there. For me, a very difficult internal fight. Shall I stop eating that or not? Because it contains dioxin, but I decided that it's too good to be not eaten. So I accept this low level of dioxin. And this is what they're doing today. They burn the stuff. They burn it because there's no space left anymore. So the mafia, the Camorra, pays people 50 euros to set fire on the waste. And there are hundreds of these fires every day, everywhere in that region. And you can imagine if you burn toxic waste, you get a high-speed production of dioxin, which is not slowly going into the groundwater as the other toxic waste over decades, but immediately spreading across the region. And the cancer rates in South Italy are exploding. Here you see a statistic that was done not by the government. The government refuses to do statistics on cancer there. They say that's not different from other regions, so we don't do extra statistics here. But the doctors themselves collect data among themselves. And this is one of such a statistics that we got from one of these doctors. In Italy, if you want to go to a hospital, you get a ticket from your doctor with a specific number that indicates the disease you might have. And there are some specific tickets for specific cancer types. And here you see how these tickets develop in the recent years. After more than 2 decades, having it in the groundwater, people get cancer. This is another statistics. You can't read that, but it's about the level of dioxin in your blood. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, says it should not be more than 9 picogram. Whatever that means, I have no clue. And here you see some analysis of people in Acerra, that's one of these places, 255 picogram, 47, 51, 40, 43. Then in Napoli, 74, 47, 60. 9 is the max you should have. You see, it is getting into the blood of people in that region. They all, sooner or later, will have cancer. And some activists speak of this region as being in a biocide, it's a kind of genocide done with biological means. The first thing that we did was to analyze the supply chain, try to understand how does that work, that some waste, let's say from a nuclear plant in France or from Siemens in Germany, ends up in Campania. And nobody has done this before. There's no supply chain of toxic waste. And if you look at, you can't see that, and it's not my focus today, but there are several steps, and the mafia can interfere on each of these steps. So everything can be completely legal until the final step, and then they come into the game, and then they dump it somewhere in an illegal place. Or they can be the supplier right from the start. And since they interfere at all places, they can be the one who does the certification and say, well, this is household waste. So they relabel the waste. And then they put the household waste under motorway or under construction. And it's not household waste, so they have to close the building and the street at a certain point again. So the mafia interferes everywhere. It's a $20 billion business for the Camorra per year. And 20 billion, it's just them. The 'Ndrangheta also makes a roughly 20 billion per year. They are specialized in atomic waste. And they put it on ships and sink it in front of the Italian coastline. Here it's more onshore, and the other one are offshore. Mafia organizations are often very well aligned. They divide labor in order to avoid violence among themselves. What we did so far is we are driven by this question, how is that possible? That you have a whole landscape devastated, and nobody talks about that. We do discourse analysis, so we did a lot of interviews already with prosecutors, judges, priests, doctors, activists, investigators, you name it. A lot of people with whom we talked in that region and beyond to understand what's going on here and why is there silence. And we are still in the process of doing more interviews. I just asked the Italian government for the permission to interview one of these mafiosi in prison. That would be an exciting information piece here, because there are some of these who became later pentiti, which means they collaborate with the police. They're still in prison, but they're protected, and they have privileges, and they talked about these things with the police. So I want to get close to one of them. What we found so far, and it's very preliminary, is that it seems that the public discourse on that topic was deviated from the very beginning, but with various framing strategies. For instance, at the beginning, about 20 years ago, there was even a commission in the Italian parliament investigating it. But it was framed as an economic problem. this waste potentially is money. So how much money is it worth? How can we deal with that so that it does not get just dumped, but is used and turned into money? Then there was a phase where they challenged the idea that it's a problem of toxic waste. You remember maybe from the news that sometimes they present waste problems of Napoli, where you see all this waste piling up in the city of Napoli. So for many years, the toxic waste was not discussed because people discussed about Napoli waste, household waste. But the household waste is the surface, the symptom of the toxic waste problem. So the attention gets deviated here again. First economically framed, then household waste framed, and now we're in a third phase, and now it looks a bit like the tobacco industry strategy. So now people start to challenge the data. They say, well, there is not more cancer in that region than elsewhere. The Italian Minister of Health 1 month ago went there and said, well, the problem in that region is that people have unhealthy diets. So they still deny that. Even the representatives of the farmers in the region deny it. And their reason is obvious. If it becomes public that there is high toxic levels in their product, they are all dead. So nobody has an interest to talk about that. Nobody. And that's one of the reasons, I assume, why this system was so stable for more than 2 decades without someone coming up and raising the voice. Everyone somehow profits from the system.
So far, are you planning to analyze the discourse from the interviews and combine with some archival sources? For
Yes,
example?
we look at interviews, we look at the main newspapers of Italy, Corriere della Sera, Repubblica, and the main newspapers from the region. And we look at documents from the parliament. The Anti-Mafia Commission has tons of investigations. So we take both.
And you would take into account the source or who is talking, like the identity of the interviewee, because I mean, I see your interviewees is a very diverse group and have a different discourses. So are you planning to do something about who they are or who they were before?
We will, because that's a particular problem of the mafia research. You never know on which side these guys really are. We interviewed one anti-mafia judge, and this guy obviously is on the wrong side, as we learned afterwards, because he has suppressed documents, he has protected mafia people and delayed things. But on the other side, we don't know whether this is just a strategy of the pro-mafia people to throw dirt at him, to make him incredible. So you always have this challenge here that you don't know in how far you always have this challenge in this kind of research, but here in particular, you don't know whether they're good or bad people you're talking with.
This is one last there's more comment. This particular angle of your research is more of interest. I mean, we'll talk at lunch, but from a reporting and accounting perspective, there's a whole theorization and framing process of discourse analysis of, you mentioned like deflection, for example, you turn the attention somewhere else or you stay silent. Each one of them constitute a strategy or across time and now across actors. So I think it's fascinating to have this kind of...
It would be good if you can give me some sources.
Yes, yeah. Well.
Excellent.
Actually, my question is how do you identify the mafia? Because many of these activities that you mentioned here is happening, polluting the nature is happening by illegal companies, and maybe it's my idea of the mafia was what I saw in the Godfather movie. And how do you know discern these two activities? Is it belongs to mafia? Is it not mafia?
What I describe here is not just particularly relevant for mafia organizations, because, as you say, companies around the world do it themselves without mafia organizations. If you look at China, for instance, China is shipping all the toxic waste to Tibet, putting it in the hills there. So, and in India, companies just throw their stuff wherever they want, some companies. Organized crime comes into the game when the system gets organized. when there is criminal organizations who do this systematically. So it is pretty much following the general definition of organized crime, 2 or 3 people getting together and doing something that is systematically that is against the law, and they replace governments to a certain degree in what they do. So they play a regulatory role here as well. And pragmatically, it's just the organizations that are defined as organized crime, like Camorra, 'Ndrangheta, and Cosa Nostra.
I have 2 questions. Do you have access to the discourse inside the mafia system for the participants to have their own legitimacy internally?
Yes. There are there are telephone discussions between mafiosi that have been intercepted by the Italian police, that are partly public, so everyone can look at them, and we use them as well, so to see how they make sense of it. And one of the elements that comes out of that is maybe also an answer to the question of silence. The problem is the toxic waste problems are abstract. So it's not that you die immediately if you have toxic waste. Possible as well, but rarely happens. It takes decades to have an impact. And if the problem is so abstract, you can even put it in your own garden. That's what the mafia people live in that region. They live there.
And my second question is that there is an organic movement of local food production in Italy and slow food movement.
Yes.
Are they aware of this, and what is their discourse?
I haven't talked with slow food people yet, but it's a good point. I have to do that. I'm not sure whether they are talking about that, because as I said, the producers have no interest in this becoming public. If you are a slow food partner, and you do mozzarella production, you don't want that people know that there's dioxin in it. It destroys your business. So you are a victim, but the only way to defend yourself, to survive, is not to make it public that you are a victim. So this project is still ongoing, also very early. And there's one that has been finished and will be published this year, which is a bit different, because it's not about the question, why didn't things work? It's more on the other side, why did it work? So here we have one case where a change process to a certain degree worked well, in a setting where all the attempts to make a change before did not work. And our question was, why did it work? What was different? What did these guys do to make it happen? And this is the fight against the Pizzo, which is the protection money in Sicily. The Pizzo, as I said, is a practice that is in Sicily since 150 years. So over generations, people learned that they pay a private tax, that's how they might perceive it, to the local mafia boss. And in return for that tax, they get a certain level of protection, which the government doesn't give them. And if something is routinized for 150 years, you take it for granted. You pay, your parents paid, your grandparents paid, and so on. And there's nothing you can do about it. That's the perception. The Pizzo doesn't bring a lot of money to the mafia. They make money with drugs, with waste, with many other things. The Pizzo is important because it symbolizes your acceptance of my power in that place here, in my quarter. I'm the boss. And you pay, and therefore you accept me being the boss here. And the mafia needs a strong local background to hide and to organize its businesses. And therefore, the Pizzo is a key pillar of the power of the mafia, even though it doesn't contribute much in terms of money. And if you challenge that key pillar, you threaten the whole system, because the mafia cannot survive well in a context that is hostile to them. They need collusion. The mafia reacts in 3 ways to people who challenge the Pizzo. The first one is they isolate them. So suddenly all your friends withdraw from you, or your customers don't come anymore. or you are criticized in the media for what you do. The second step is they burn your stuff or they damage your stuff. And the third step is they kill you. They never start with the third step. They always start with the other ones. Because you cannot just kill someone who is supported by the environment. That is too risky. You first have to isolate that person. And you see the same with the mafia judges who were killed. They were first isolated and then killed. And people know these things. They know that if they would raise their voice, the mafia would isolate them and their business would suffer. There was one guy who tried this nonetheless in the early 90s, Libero Grassi, 1991. He was a owner of a clothing factory with about 100 employees. And at one point in time, he wrote an open letter to the mafia in the local newspaper and said, I will no longer pay you. And he became a hero in Italy. He was on TV. You see him on Rai 3, where he's interviewed. He was interviewed by the NZZ in Switzerland. He became an anti-mafia hero very quickly after that letter. And in August, they killed him in front of his house. So the message is clear. You can be the famous guy and everyone likes you outside, but here we can kill you. You do not dare to challenge our system. This is deeply ingrained in their experience of Sicilians. If you challenge the mafia, that's what will come out of this. You cannot change the system. The system is stable. But as I said, and just to quote one of these famous mafia judges, Giovanni Falcone, the mafia is a human phenomenon, and thus, like all human phenomena, it has a beginning, an evolution, and it will also have an end. It's not possible to think it otherwise. But how do you change such a system that is so stable, 150 years? What do we know about institutional change in general? Institutions are the values, beliefs, and practices that we take for granted. Sooner or later they get changed, hybridized, or whatever, so they move on. And how do they get changed? Well, literature discusses two strategies. First is you make material changes. For instance, you create a new kind of counting rule, and then they apply. Or you challenge the values and beliefs. So either you manipulate the surface of institutions, the practices, or you manipulate what's under the waterline, the values and beliefs. And there's another element, we shortly discussed this when you were in Lausanne, this paradox of heroism, that institutionalism has designed or has theorized change as an activity of a few heroes who challenge a big system. And especially in the case of mafia, this is what people who know nothing about institutional theory would say is necessary. If you want to fight the mafia, you have to be a hero. And then you are killed. But that's what these people do. They are heroes, they challenge the system, and they are willing to pay that price. As you will see when I come to the analysis, what one of the things we show is that you do not need heroes, even if you want to change a system that is so extreme and so violent as the mafia system. On the contrary, you have to de-heroize the system in order to make it change. We focus on values. And what we saw in the literature is that there is a lot of theoretical debate on values as an element of institutions and institution change, but not much empirical studies. We know, everyone says, well, you have to appeal to the values of people to make them change, or you have to target the values of the change maker you want to have in your new institutional setting. Change is infused by values. This is taken for granted. And if you look at the debate on values outside institutional theory, you find some very interesting things. You find, for instance, that values can be analyzed both applying to individuals and to institutions. Values are used to understand meaning and action. And values are performative. So values in theory should be a very interesting tool that you can use if you want to make an institution change. And actually this is what we found in our study. But as I said, very few studies use values in an empirical way, and even less studies look at micro-level change, so in individuals and institutions. Here is the story of what happened in Palermo. 2004, there are 7 young people, and they have finished their studies in Palermo. And as most people who finish their studies in Italy, they find no job. And they're frustrated. They think about opening a bar together. And then they make a budget. And when they make the budget, they realize they have to include the Pizzo in the budget, the protection money. And they don't want to pay a Pizzo. But they know they cannot open a bar without paying the Pizzo. So they are frustrated and they're really angry. So overnight, in June, they put this poster all over downtown Palermo. A people who pays the Pizzo is a people without dignity. So this was not in order to change something or to create a movement. This was just frustration about their personal situation. Dignity is a key value in Italy, especially in South Italy. It is a very old value. The Roman Empire was building on 2 values, pietas and dignitas. And Romulus was killing Remus in the mythology of Rome because he violated the dignitas of the city. So the dignitas is even more important than your brother. So this resonated with people in Palermo very strongly, and it was in the media all over the place. The police started to investigate. Who are these guys? The politicians. The 7 young people were in a dilemma now. They either could stay anonymous and so keep all danger from them, or go public and say that was us. They started by putting some anonymous letters in the newspapers. This is one of them where they said, "Our action seeks to stop the silence. It is an act of rebellion against the mafia subculture and a way of dissociating from the outrageous silence consolidated around the problem of mafia extortion." So silence again. But it's still anonymous. And at a certain point in time, they understood that if they stay anonymous, they cannot do anything more than just throwing some letters here and there into the public. So they decided to create a group and become public and fight against the Pizzo. How did they do this? Here is a timeline of things they did. So the first thing is they put these stickers on the wall. The second thing is they spent 1 year convincing consumers to sign a list that says if there would be a shop that would have a label, "I don't pay Pizzo," I would prefer to buy in that shop. They collected in the city of Palermo more than 3,000 such signatures over 1 year. With this list of signatures, they went to a newspaper and they published it. Then they went to the shop owners and they told the shop owners, "Look, here are all these people who would come to you and buy your stuff if you were Pizzo free. Do you want to join us?" They worked for 1 year to convince a couple of hundred of shop owners to put this label in their window, and then they published the list from one day to the other. And you see, this is very clever. The mafia cannot kill 300 shop owners or 3,000 consumers. They shifted the risk to the other side. They reduced the risk of people participating in the game. Then they went to schools because they said, this is a cultural problem. We have to change people's perception of Pizzo from the very early age on. So they did projects with children on legality. And then they went and asked the shop owners and the other people to create their own associations so that the whole movement became independent from themselves. The success, the relative success, yes, please.
Okay.
Yes, I hear you.
It's about the actual paradox of embedded agency, as you said in the previous slide. So as I read the paper and as you said here, we see that it's not heroic in the sense that one individual is doing everything. And as you said, it's a network of powerless actors coming to change something. But in another sense, I think it's still a heroic in the sense that it counters what you said earlier about having these values and beliefs inscribed and ingrained, generation after generation in these people. how come this first group of 7 people, disembedded themselves?
Well, they
To
are
me, that's a
outside
bit
already.
still heroic, and maybe I need to know where they came from, how
Yes.
come they were different in disembedding themselves. Still, I think that's a bit, at least theoretically, heroic. And again, about the people that were signing in onto the cause, and eventually now, after having that number that you said, we know that transferred the risk. But each individual, when they were signing, they didn't know how many people are going to sign eventually. So they
they made this clear that they would not publish a list until they had a few hundred shop owners.
Okay.
So that was part of the strategy. These people are embedded in the system. They are Sicilians. They are part of this culture. They understand what resonates with that culture. But they are not embedded in the sense that they are part of this field of organizations paying Pizzo. They are jobless students. They have a broader mindset because they have studied. They have seen the outside world a bit more than the shop owners did. And they come from the periphery of the system. Maybe that would be one assumption. If you want to change such systems, you have to do it from the periphery, because then you are underestimated from the first day on. And the mafia doesn't act against you when they still could act against you, because they don't see you as a threat. You're just an unemployed student. You're not part of the system. The heroism, yes, these young people were heroes in a certain sense. They risked something, but they did not make the change happen. That was all the other people. They could not turn the system around without the support of thousands of people saying, yes, I join you. And they were not heroes in the sense that they risked something big. If you're a consumer and you just sign that list, there's no risk. Nothing happened to nobody. If you have 300 shops around you do the same thing, certain risk, but not the same kind of level than Libor Grassi was facing. So it is spreading the risk. You don't have to be a hero to participate. That's the myth. You can be a hero, but you don't have to be. Just very quickly about the success. About 10% of the shops downtown Sicily do not pay anymore. You could say, well, this is not much. We move from 90% who paid before to 80% who pay. But in a world in which everyone takes this institution for granted and says this is unchangeable, this is a big success. So success of change is always relative. I wouldn't say it's an institutional change, but it's a crack in the institution, which is already not bad. So what kind of sources did we need? We looked into reports of the parliament, newspapers, the stuff Addiopizzo was publishing. We had interviewed the shop owners who pay, shop owners who no longer pay, with the activists, anti-mafia police. We looked into the diaries of some of these activists from their very first day on in this initiative. They kept diaries. We could read them all and work with them. And we went with them when they went to the shop owners to convince them. So this is what we did. Because of time, I guess I skip over methodology because you know all how these things are done. We coded the data. Maybe one thing. This project is a single case study. And normally you are told never write single case studies because you can never publish them, which is to a certain degree true. And you cannot derive a lot of very reliable conclusions from one case studies. But if you work with organized crime data, and you get data on one case, you can go down on your knees and think that you have these data. It's unthinkable that you get 2 or 3 of these and can compare them. I guess what helped us to publish this study is that this kind of data everyone finds very sexy and very exciting. We had 3 reviewers who from the beginning said, your paper is very bad, but your data is great. So go on. So if you have really good data that is a bit different from the data they normally get, it helps. So even if it's nobody from in the AMJ challenged the fact that it's a one case study. Nobody. And we were really concerned before, but that was fine. We coded the data in 3 steps. We first found that there were kind of value-based information in it, and process information. We coded then the process steps that we could find and the values, and grouped them into two types of processes. One was about transforming individual minds, and one was about transforming groups thinking. And just, you cannot read this, but this is just a list of the values they used with the different groups, starting with dignity to union, security, critical consumption, legality, solidarity, community, transparency. And the amazing thing was, whenever they approached one particular stakeholder, like a customer, like a student in school, a teacher, like a shop owner, they used a different value, but the same process. They tailored their message always to something they perceived as being the most important for this particular stakeholder, or the most interesting. The children at school, they hooked by referring to these two heroes of the anti-Mafia fight, the judges Falcone and Borsellino, showing their pictures, referring to legality as a value, trying to convince the students of that. They did not try to create values in people. That's important. They used the values these people had already and transformed the meaning. And here's what some of these citations to support that. They have changed the meaning of important words such as dignity, security. For example, when they come out with a list of entrepreneurs, they were very good in convincing entrepreneurs that security meant the opposite of what people get generally intended, that is, collaborating with the mafia and obstructing the police.
Exactly what you just said, that they didn't try to create new values, to instill new values in people, but they try to use the values that were already there.
Yes.
And so I was wondering why in the second code, the second phase, you call it like anchoring, where I would have seen more like relabeling values and try to reshape values that are already there. Because
I'll show you later on
okay.
each step.
Okay.
But the important thing, the important insight that I see in this study is this fact that you can change people's behavior if you appeal to the values they hold already. You cannot change them if you try to implant values in them. This is maybe why all this global warming evidence does not resonate with Tea Party people, because it is not in their values. And if it's not in their values, they do not adapt their values to the facts, they adapt the facts to their values. Sorry.
Thank you. But just to follow up, though, on that, because I think that indeed this is quite interesting, which what you're describing as a mechanism, which is that actually you use the same word, but you're going to actually really transform the meaning profoundly to the point of actually completely reversing it in the case that you're talking about, in the case of security. So even though you're not changing the term, you're still changing the value. So you see what I mean? I mean, it's probably a continuum. So you probably have situations in which you can make very minimal changes. But in the case where you manage indeed to change the meaning of security from security means paying the Pizzo and being protected by the mafia, to security means kind of trusting the police and trusting authority or legality. You've really you use the same word, but you've completely transformed the value.
You transform the meaning, but what I mean here is you do not appeal to a value that you think is important, but they maybe not. For instance, if you look at anti-tobacco advertising, what they normally say is it's risky, so don't do it. But that's not something that teenagers are interested in. On the contrary, they like risky decisions. So you cannot appeal to them by saying, well, look at your health. They don't care. This advertising tries to implement a value in them that they don't have at that moment. That's what I mean here. Yes, they play with these values, they turn the meaning around, but it's a value these people hold already. But they have a kind of distorted interpretation of the value, maybe, or one that is not useful for solving the problem. And just to give you a little overview, here is what we did. We compared what did people believe about this value before and afterwards. For instance, what does security mean? One of the shop owners said, only the mafia can guarantee your security. If you want to be secure, the only thing you have to do is paying the Pizzo. And now, some others say security is an issue under the responsibility of the government. The only security is through the government and the police. The same value, but a different interpretation. And this is done for each of these values. And this is not an easy process. It takes a lot of time. They have to go there again and again and again to talk with these people. And they cannot go there and start by talking about the mafia. They have to talk about something else first. Get the trust of them, which sometimes just doesn't work. Yes, please.
So this process of actually reprogramming the values, would the outcome have been different if it would have been initiated by a single person versus a group, in the sense that this thing that it began as a collective effort in the first. So the mechanism is, like, as you say, reprogramming the values, but as it started as a collective effort in the beginning?
No, it does not.
It doesn't.
They go to each shop owner individually. They try to convince each one, each consumer, each shop owner, each teacher alone. And then they unite them. So if you talk with me, you are the shop owner. You do not see other shop owners doing the same. It's just me convincing you. I'm the activist. I come alone and you are alone. So it's not a group thing from the beginning. They understand that they have to turn it into a group dynamic later on to give the people the strength and confidence, but at the beginning it's individual.
But they started off as a group. That is what I really meant in the beginning. Like, yes, the influence is like one-to-one, but the effort, well, the example that you gave, like the person, the businessman who stood up against, versus now you're gathering together, seven students or coming in together. So that effort began it was a collective effort, and then they divide onto, okay, saying, yeah, you go and influence kind of thing. So had it been possible, or rather, if it didn't start as a group, would this thing be possible? That's what, I was, the underscoring the collective beginning of this whole, movement.
Well, I guess if it would have been one student, it would have worked as well with the same process, because the process was getting one person after another on board and making it public only if it's big, not before. Because the mechanism of change is not group, it's individual to individual. Mm-hmm. So whether there are 7 or 1 doesn't count, because it's not 7 who go to a shop, it's 1. 1 to this shop, 1 to the other shop.
Okay.
Just a follow-up on this, I was thinking that they not just try to retransform the value that were infused by the mafia and, let's say, transmit the opposite, but they also used, at least partly, the same procedure, same practices of the mafia. So they catch individually, so never in group, so one-to-one, and it's like a reproduction of the same process, but inverted somehow. Mm-hmm. So that's probably why it also works, because it refers to something that are familiar with, and they see it transposed on the other side.
That's an interesting point. I didn't think about it. Yes, makes sense.
Actually, it's exactly like that, to follow up on that, but a bit more practical, I guess. Didn't, in your case, do you have any data or about whether mafia came up with the counter strategy to act as activist impersonators to just see who is cracking up? And
yes, the mafia was in a very difficult situation. When they realized that there was a threat, it was already big. Mm-hmm. So at the beginning, they tried to infiltrate the system, and that didn't really work. Because the guys, they work with the anti-mafia police, with their database, they check newcomers. And the mafia, even if they wanted to infiltrate, they had no interest in the next shop putting this label into the window, because this was a clear signal against the mafia. So infiltrating them strengthens the mafia, because it's another shop who shows that label. For them it was difficult. They threatened some of these shop owners. I have eaten in a restaurant in Palermo, which was one of the first, and until today they have police in front of the door. But nothing happened since 2004. But still, there's every day, every evening, a policeman in front of the door. Some of the activists have been beaten up, but you cannot kill 7 students, because then you have, like with the Falcone Borsellino murder, you have the whole country against you. You cannot kill many shop owners. You have the whole country against you. And then the police comes in, and the mafia has the strategy of being invisible. since the 1990s, not to kill anymore until it is necessary. So it was contrary to the strategy they had in place of being invisible, and at a certain point in time it was just too much. This system works without the 7 years. Even if they kill them now, it doesn't change anything. It's too big. It's industrial organizations that are on board. It's many organizations they created themselves. So it hits its own dynamic now.
I really like it. It's the process that you're describing reminds me a little bit of what you see in self-organized complex systems, like flock of fish. They, in order to protect themselves against sharks, what they do is flock together, and they have very simple rules on how to behave. Is once there's a shark that comes in, it becomes very difficult for the shark to focus on one fish. And so they just move away, and then as a result of that, the shark misses the focus and misses the target.
That's very similar.
So it's a little bit similar. So, and that's self-organizing. So it's the same thing. There's no centralized control. It's just a few simple rules.
Yeah.
But here you have some kind of starting of those rules, nevertheless. So
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
Can you go back to the slide before? I was just wondering whether these were the same people, the same category of people who changed their minds, or
Yes.
did you see any
shop
typology of people, reacting differently to the reprogramming
Yes.
strategy?
What we have is always people saying, well, before I joined, I believed this, and now I believe that. Or we have shop owners who say, we don't participate in this because of. And others who say, yes, we participate because of, and you see the change. And many of them even say, we have changed our minds.
So,
please.
If I can just ask one question. You started off the presentation by discussing when you want to change an institution, or in your case, crack an institution, you can either change the material practices or the artifacts, or you can change the values. But as I see it here, and I got the sense that you're focusing on the latter. Here, it seems rather there's a certain rhetorical strategy that this organization uses. So I'm missing that layer in this story, and it seems that rather the values are being changed, but I'm missing to see what kind of rhetorical strategies these people are using in order to change.
Let me go to the model that we found, or the process that we found behind it. I'm over the time already, so how many minutes can I? It's fine.
Until 12:30.
We try to find patterns in how they approach shop owners, consumers, students, police, and this is what we believe was behind them. They did not use this intentionally, of course. This was not a strategy they invented and said, now step 1, then we go to step 2. It is something that emerged as how they processed unconsciously. In the end, when we showed them our analysis, they were surprised that, yes, this is exactly what we're doing. But they didn't know it themselves. So the first step is what we call hooking. And this is, one guy goes to a shop owner just to talk. Just to know the guy, get familiarized with him, and they talk about whatever, not about the mafia. It's just to build trust and to get the people on board, the willingness to talk. Then we have a step that we call anchoring, where they start to talk about Pizzo and say, look at the consequences of what you do. And look at the way you see the world right now. Do you think this is comparable to what shop owners would do in Germany or Switzerland? So they start this by anchoring a different idea about security in this case, or legality for students in the minds of their partner. Then in the third step, they do two things. The first is they try to help these people imagine a different form of behavior. Imagine you would live in an ideal world. How would this situation look like? Would you pay this Pizzo? If you would not pay the Pizzo, what would you do instead? What can you do in order to live this other kind of reality, to make it happen? This is a discussion that they do with individual shop owners, students, teachers, consumers. And then they start to unite them, to bring them together. And as we have seen in the data, which is not a surprise, in a low trust culture, this is very, very difficult. Because they don't want to talk with each other. They don't want to talk with the police. They don't want to unite and talk about mafia things. Nobody talks about mafia. So why should they? A very difficult step, but from the perspective of the activists, an important step, because you will not, now you have transformed their minds until here. But this transformation will not lead to different behavior if you do not have the context in which this kind of behavior makes sense. If you then leave them alone and the mafia guy comes again and asks for the money, they will pay. What can they do? But as soon as they get together with others, other shop owners around the corner, potential customers, the police who says we will come and we will patrol more often in your quarter and so on. As soon as you can exchange with the others, you feel that you are not alone. You have a place to meet, which we call the safe space. So you have a place where you do not have to fear open discussions about the mafia, where you can develop ideas together. So if this guy comes to your shop, I observe this, I'm your neighbor, I will call the police, or I will come to your shop and support you. Things like that developed among themselves, not driven by the activists, but among themselves. The activists just brought them together to give them the space to exchange views and to connect all their ideas, students, consumers, shop owners, police, connect all these ideas to a new culture, an alternative Sicilian culture, and then to live that culture together. I might lose customers because the mafia will try to isolate me, but here there are new ones, and they will stay.
Yeah, I think that this is very fascinating because this is essentially the microdynamics of institutionalization or institutional change in that case, but in fact leading towards institutionalization. So I have two questions here. One is, you know, from the paper and from the presentation, we don't have a sense of what's the failure rate along the way, in a sense, because they probably lost people on the way. And the interesting thing is, what's the share of people that is lost where? And is there a point where if you haven't lost that person, that's it, you know, you're sure you won't lose him or her anymore? So that's my first question, which is really more still at the micro level. And then there's the second question, which is the more macro institutional question, which is, you said, okay, we moved from 90 to 80 in a sense. But the big question obviously is how fragile still is this effort? When can we actually really talk at the macro level this time of an institutional change? You know, is 80 enough, or do we need to go below 50? So what's your thought on that? You know?
Yeah, well, the process continues, and they're getting more and more shops on board. For me, I would say it's not possible to say, well, if it's 20%, then I would say it's a new institution. It is a new institution, and it works in a very small context, but I would not say they changed the society. That would be too far. But they created a subculture that is very strong and resistant and is growing. And it's getting more and more support and more media coverage, and finding similar activities now in other parts of Italy. So therefore I see it going on, but I would not yet say it's a change. The mafia still wins, of course. The first point, we didn't collect data on what percentage failed, but what we found was that on each step there are dropouts. There are dropouts, for instance, already on the first step, where they go there and they do not create trust. So the shop owner doesn't trust them. Or they trust them, but they have fear. They don't want to get involved. Or they believe that this is a practice that should be there because that's how things are done here. So on each step they fail. And the guys, they told us, the students, well, sometimes we go there 5, 6, 7 times until the shop owner really understands what's the situation like. And in the interviews with the shop owners, the same comes out. At first there are these young people, long hair, they're coming, and I don't trust them. And then they come again and they bring a neighbor, and it's a different thing. So very often they go and go and go until they move from step 1 to step 2, until there's a trust. So there are dropout rates where the students just fail to convince them. And we have talked with shop owners who said, no, we don't participate, we pay.
I wonder to what extent the dropouts, because it's very similar to a process that I looked at in some work that I've done. And I looked at a group of people that stayed, a group of people that dropped out. And so the ones that were immune to the pressure, that's what I worked on. And the ones that were immune, they were immune both at symbolic and material levels. And the material levels in his case could be that maybe half of their customer base of the shop, they know includes people that are very strong in the mafia. And so as a result of that, even if they are convinced, they know that they have family ties. So on a symbolic level, they say, yes, I want to work with you, but I can't. So did you find any of those kinds of things? Or?
That's the transition here where it failed. So you anchor this kind of discourse and they understand it now. They follow you in your interpretation, but they say, I cannot do that. So this operationalization doesn't work because of reasons as you mentioned them. Fear, strong belief in the system. Well, in the mafia, it's not just that they take the money. If someone breaks in your shop and you pay protection money, they bring back your stuff. They find it for you. The government will not, but the mafia does. So there are some advantages of the system. And to understand that it's a wrong system nonetheless, that's very difficult.
I have a question. Here you have said that it is economically not very important for mafia, right? It is just one part of their big portfolio, right, where they're making billions. So here, if there was some kind of challenge, they did not really pay attention or bribe the police or, try to threaten people who are joining hands. But if something happens, let's say, when they're trying to dispose the, toxic waste or atomic waste, and if there is some kind of challenge there, then they will be much more ruthless, I think, or maybe they have some mechanism to counter it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, absolutely. That might be one of the differences between this system here and the toxic waste system. But the important element is, what do people believe? Not will they be really killed, but do they believe they got killed when they don't participate here? And that is very similar to the toxic waste situation. People know libero grassi. If you go through Palermo, at every street you find a plate with the name of a person killed because of mafia resistance. That's deeply ingrained. If you raise your voice, they might kill you. So even if it's not a real business interest of the mafia, it's, as I said, it's this highly symbolic value of the Pizzo, which is even more important than the toxic waste business. That can be delocalized. You can take the stuff from a German company and transport it through Switzerland. Over there, you don't need local people involved. But here you need them. Otherwise, your system falls down.
And so I was wondering, what about the 10% that were not participating?
Before?
Before, because you said only 90% of, well, not only, but 90% of the entrepreneurs were paying. So were they resisting? And if they were resisting, did they play a role in the process?
There are two types of organizations that did not pay before. First, organizations that are part of the mafia. So if you have a pizzeria and you are the brother of or the sister of a mafia boss, then you don't pay, but you launder money. And the second group is, if your brother is a policeman in the anti-Mafia police, I don't touch you. So these were the main groups. Maybe there were also a few resistant people, but the main groups were these two. Either connected or too dangerous to touch.
Thanks. You portrayed this case as antecedent of institutional change. But when I read the context, I mean, the Addiopizzo started in 2004, and it didn't start in '91 when the guy was killed. So some way it was already like 10, 15 years that the mafia changed strategies from the massacre to silence, basically. And also it was a little of time that the state was already fighting actively the mafia and sequestering wealth and giving back to organizations like Addiopizzo. So somehow the field was kind of ready for an organization like this, but there was already the agency spark. And the question is, it started in Sicily because the field was kind of ready, and basically it didn't start, for example, in Calabria or Campania because there was not these conditions. Or why you think we have this in Palermo and not, I don't know, in Reggio Calabria or in Napoli, something like this?
First of all, I believe that it would not have been possible without the killing of the two anti-mafia judges, Falcone and Borsellino. This created a shockwave. And this made people think. But this was 1992. When since 1992 to 2004, nothing happened. So we asked ourselves, is this maybe a very advantageous historical moment? And we checked the reports of the anti-mafia police of the years before and after. And actually the system was very strong at that time, according to the police. And the governor of Sicily at that moment was Toto Cuffaro, who is now imprisoned for being a mafioso. The political system was highly colluding at that time. So one cannot really say this was a perfect moment, but I guess this memory of the judges and the rage in people in 1992 certainly made it possible. In 1991, it wouldn't have worked, I guess, but that's speculation.
Do you have data on the people mental process of convincing themselves to stop paying the Pizzo? Because it seems to me that from a logic of collective action perspective, that changed the mental computation that they had from a cost-benefit analysis. And so how do they make sense of this, and what changed in their minds?
I would be cautious to use the cost-benefit frame, because we also checked maybe they participate because they save money. It's an economic reason. But the amounts are so low that it didn't make sense for them to do it for that.
People have many biases when they estimate risk.
Let me maybe show you a few of the citations of the entrepreneurs that make this mental change clear. I really like, that's the first step. I really liked the first discussion with him, the activist. We spoke about Sicily and Sicilian problems. I really appreciated it because people generally do not like to speak about these things. I think that discussions about my real problems created some confidence between us. So they talk about the problems of the entrepreneur, the situation in Sicily, but not the mafia. That's the first thing. I created trust. If I remember well, he, the activist, came 5 or 6 times to my shop. At a certain point, he started speaking about the mafia's consequences and how it's related to my security. That conversation shocked me. I could not stop thinking about it. That night, I discovered that we never reflect on the fact that we think about our security as mafia guys want us to think about security. That night, I understood what those crazy guys were trying to do. And we have numerous of such interviews where people say, well, there was a moment where I understood what this is about. It is very difficult for us to fully understand the meaning of legality. This is about a student now, without being biased by the mafia. One useful reflection proposed by L, name of one activist, was to think about the meaning of legality in an ideal world. So they forced people to think beyond their context, to break their frame, and to think alternatively. It was not easy to think about it. I probably, the last one, thought about it for a while, but I decided to start looking at other entrepreneurs threatened by the mafia as potential new suppliers, because this is a way to help and I also thought that the next time a colleague in our street gets some problems, instead of ignoring that situation, I will go and speak with him. This is step number 3. They activate a different behavior in them. It's not the activist that tells him, why don't you go and help the other shop owner? It's the discussion that triggers this thinking in the individual actors. What can I now do? Now that I want to change, how can I do this? And they come up with ideas. And that's the point where they have to get together to exchange these ideas, to create trust, and to make these mutual commitments. The Addiopizzo guys were very good at now we are moving towards the group effect. We're very good at presenting these meetings as secure meetings for what we had discussed with them before, the security of entrepreneurs who want to fight against the mafia. I think we used those meetings to mature our previous discussions with activists. Sharing ideas with other colleagues is always useful, especially when you are concerned about your security. So you see, they convince them that it makes sense to speak with others who think like them. They are not alone. That was one of the most difficult moments of activists, when we had to put entrepreneurs in contact with the police. We understood that the only way that this could be done was by insisting on the importance of their security. So they used the value again, that you must meet with the police, you must get them into your network, otherwise your life is too dangerous. You must be protected by them. And you see, if you are growing up in Palermo, you don't like the police. The police is the enemy as the mafia is the enemy. You keep away from all these things. So what we found, to summarize that, the first step in this whole story is the external shock, the posters, without any intention to make a change, just to raise frustration. The second thing is they use values to destabilize what people take for granted. They use the same values to progressively move them into a different mindset. And they reduce the risks for them through various strategies, like the publication of names only when there are a few hundreds, or bringing them together so that they can share the risk. And we believe it works. It worked in particular because these people came from the periphery of the system. If an entrepreneur had started that, the mafia would have perceived the guy as a risk. But since these were young students out of the system, they could operate for quite a while before the mafia realized they are really dangerous for us. But then it was too late. They were too big. And there are interceptions of discussions among the mafiosi who show that they were underestimating, that they were frustrated about the situation, that they knew it would be very difficult to infiltrate the system, and they didn't know what to do with it. So what we argue is there is this context. You take out these values. You change these values first on an individual base. We call this process moralization. So something that is taken for granted or amoral, or something that you perceive as immoral, is turned into moral, working with the police. So you moralize something people did not think about before in moral terms. And in the second step, you integrate this new thinking into new practices. That's where the material part comes into the game. You have to create meeting rooms, you need labels, you need all these things that can create a community. But that's the second step. The contribution, we call this strategic values work. Values work is a term that was introduced by Gieman and others in a paper recently, and we say, well, values work, so the emerging of new institutions via values, can be done in a strategic way. So you can use these values and move an institution somewhere via these values. So values, if what value researchers tell us is true, that values are the deepest part of our individual identity, then if you speak to these values, you can get the most reliable change process than if you just operate on the surface of practices and change practices. The second contribution we see is that we argue that the paper is a contribute to the discussion on post-heroic or anti-heroic change. Because it was not the 6 young people, 7 who changed the world, it was these thousands of participants who each of one was not a hero, who could do things much easier than if they would have done it with the idea, I'm willing to sacrifice my life. So change comes from the periphery, spreads, and becomes big, and has nothing to do with a few change agents who control and dominate the whole process. Thank you.
I guess I have really a burning question, and then we might have a few more, but my question really has to do with why don't you actually push another contribution which I see in that paper, which is a contribution that is very much connected to debates in institutional theory right now around the connection between institutionalization and social movement, because you're really showing the absence of boundary between institutionalization processes and social movement building. So you're really, you know, the moralization integration part is really how you move from the destabilization of individual values towards the construction of a social movement. And this is an institutionalization process. And this is very much, I think, an interesting theoretical contribution of the, it could be presented as an interesting theoretical contribution.
We had a discussion on institutions in the first version. But in the first version, we had too many things going on. So there was something about fields. We used the term hyperstable. And the reviewer said, drop all these things. Make it a simple story. And that's what we did. We made a simple story. But I agree, that this is an important point. But the risk is then you need an additional literature, the social movement literature. You have to connect to this as well. And it makes it very big then, suddenly. And reviewers don't like big stories.
So I have a burning question, but a different style. Okay, so how would you think this would work or be applied for the terrorist movement? Maybe you have something about some kind of solution there. I don't know.
Yeah.
I know it's nothing really similar, but it, in a way, you know, obviously it's a very hot topic today. It unfortunately will be, but an ideology based with values. Similar to Mafia, I guess. So
I guess one learning could be that we have to think about how we frame the message, the communication to those who might join these terrorist organizations and to keep them from doing it. It has to be done in their value system somehow, taking their frustration, their marginalization, their whatever situation, and speak to that. And give them something around their own values. And I guess this is what I would see as a key learning for all kind of context. I was struck recently when the Catholic Church started to engage in the debate on global warming. And then I learned that for years the Catholic Church had argued, well, this is not our topic, environmental things. But when people started to frame global warming around poverty, so it's the poor who suffer first from global warming, then the church jumped on the boat. It was framed in their kind of value system, and then they participated. And now they're a voice in the whole discussion. And that's the learning, I guess, the key learning here. If you want to make change, deep change, via values, speak to those values, understand what these values are. Environmental consumerism is the same. We speak to general consumers as if they were the same as the green consumers, and then we fail, because they are not resonating with these values. We have to speak to other values to get them on board, to mainstream responsible consumption.
Maybe the problem is that we don't know what the values of terrorism are.
But we can find out. We can find out.
Well, I think you can use this to understand how terrorists recruit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, on the other side.
Yes.
But then can you do the reverse? So.
It's probably the same process, or similar process.
Okay, so do we have a few more questions?
Yeah. Very fast. I have some concern with the first contribution, let's say, because I mean, I believe there is, and I see the value work, but as how you presented and also how you wrote it in the paper, I don't see the strategic. So let's say you said yourself before that it was an emergent process, and looking at your work, they say, yes, it was like this. So therefore implies that they don't have a real strategy. Mm-hmm. But I don't believe they don't have a real strategy, because I mean, surely in the first year when they were trying to hook up, they probably didn't have a strategy. But soon after, I think that they saw what were the practices that were working and how they could continue. So kind of strategy, even if not clear, they should have been somehow. I don't know why you decided to frame it like this and not with a more clear strategic approach. I don't know.
Yeah,
if you wanted to let's say, define this concept of strategic value.
Well, I agree. These young students did not have this as a strategy. They didn't sit together and said, now we hook them, and then we activate. That's not what happened. But you can take this you can take this pattern from what they did and use this pattern strategically. That's what we mean. So it's not the strategy in this project, it's a strategy ex post. Now you have a pattern that you can use in whatever context, terrorism, global, responsible consumption, whatever, and apply it because it's powerful. That's the idea.
Last question.
I don't know. So actually, I agree with Marie-Laure that when I read the paper, I had this, now everybody's framing it as burning feeling that there are a lot of social movements, things that are interesting for social movement scholars and those who work on institutionalization and social movements in this paper, and it could have been directed towards that audience as well. And the other one is translation. I like Calonne, and you already cited performativity for Calonne, or Czarniawska, and people like that. And I saw a lot of striking similarities in the process, and also, fruitful differences. But I would have liked to see that in a kind of discussion. But I guess now that the paper is published, I guess.
Too late.
It's too late, but basically but the question could be that was it you or the reviewers, because you said that they wanted a simple story, or did you think that yourself that it's kind of similar to the translation story or not?
Yes. We from the very beginning saw three theoretical streams to which we could connect. The performativity, institutional theory, and social movement. And in the first version we had a bit of everything. And that's a big mistake that you shouldn't make, because it makes the story too complex, too confusing. You have to sharpen it somehow. You can see many things in this data. The first thing that we saw was a new field, a hyperstable field. So we defined a new field, and we told a story around that field. And the reviewer said, well, that's not very interesting, but the value thing is very interesting. Our editor was Tima Bansal, who has just before that written a paper on values. She was on values. So just from a strategic point of view, if you want to publish, look into something that the editor likes. And she liked the value stuff. And she didn't like the hyperstable field and the social movement stuff. And the editor said, well, there's too much going on in the paper, make the story simpler. So we had to cut. But I agree, you can tell the same story through other. We could have told a story about framing as well. So.
Okay, so I think we want to thank very much Guido, because this was a fascinating discussion.
My pleasure.
Fascinating presentation. So thank you.